Thank you for your introduction.
Sorry, nearly knocking me out.
Knocking me out at the first step. Being removed many years from my caring role, I will not be relating a typical carer story, but touching on our journey, which began, sorry, can you hear me?
Put it down a little bit.
Almost 16 years ago, when my late husband became ill, and he was almost 2 years before we had a definitive diagnosis. After obtaining,
If you come a little bit closer to it.
Okay. After obtaining a second opinion, this was a diagnosis of vascular dementia at the early age of 62. Yes, there were supports and services, not easily accessible, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, for people under 65. Ultimately, receiving a diagnosis was almost a relief, but the intervening 2 years were particularly hard on all. The diagnosis changed the whole course of our lives, and it was then that we began our journey into living with dementia. Both the person with the diagnosis and their carer need a post-diagnostic pathway to guide and support them on their journey. I'll come back to that later. The memory clinic was led by a consultant psychiatrist for the elderly, a clinical psychologist and a nurse, and I effectively became the fourth member of that team. This was particularly empowering, giving me a say in the management of Noel's care and monitoring his medication. At the outset, I undertook a carers course run by the HSE and led by the team psychologist. Rarely you're asked, how are you? I'm fine, but at the same time feeling any one of the 4 emotions on the slide. It was a mental, emotional isolation, not being able to share with Noel as we would in a normal way. There's something in dementia. Dementia and me. Becoming a full-time carer doesn't have to mean losing the life you had with all its contacts. You need to consider your own needs as well as the needs of your loved one. You must think of yourself. If your health begins to suffer and you can no longer continue, your loved one will lose their primary carer, and this could be traumatic for them. You are not being selfish in taking care of yourself and taking care of your own health. Carers need care too. Without going into specifics, the role of a carer is physically difficult at the best of times, but the role of a carer of a person with dementia is both physically and mentally draining. Physical and mental tiredness are the predominant aspects of caring and leads to stress. This was borne out in the research by Trinity College Dublin and jointly funded by the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland, which found that spousal carers were prone to an extremely high level of stress. Watching the loved one of my life fading was most daunting and heartbreaking. This was compounded by the lack of understanding of people in general about the condition. Through the various sessions of the carers course, many very difficult experiences were highlighted, and it became very clear that stigma was a huge problem for many, especially those living in rural areas, resulting in their isolation and fear of the unknown, which is why we need to talk about stigma. While I was not personally adversely affected by the stigma surrounding dementia, I was aware that other carers were. Stigma is rooted in fear and misunderstanding of the reality of what is. It is one of the most persistent barriers to understanding what it is like to receive a diagnosis of dementia. There is a critical need to understand through education as to how to recognise the early onset of symptoms, and to appreciate what it is for the person to cope with the diagnosis and to learn to live with the condition. The Disability Act defines disability, framing dementia as a disability, respects the personhood of the person with dementia, and encourages a focus on the person's retained abilities in contrast to their losses. How the brain works is still a mystery. The person with dementia is subjected to a double-edged sword, living with dementia and potential negative attitude and behaviour of others. There is a consequent need to understand the nature and experience of stigma in dementia from the perspective of those who experience it and its effects. 30 to 40 years ago, cancer used to be referred to as the big C. We now have the big D. And for people to not suffer in silence, we need to destigmatise it. So how can we do this? Education which challenges beliefs and attitudes needs to be combined with other interventions to eliminate stigma. Sorry, I'm a bit short of breath because I had a bit of an accident on my way.
Would you like some water?
No, I'm fine, it's just I'm a bit, it's my breath. Thank you. Stigma is clearly still an issue for some people, still a dark secret, which is why education programmes highlighting awareness are so important and essential. The reality of the stigma attaching to the diagnosis for both the person with dementia and their carer is that they become invisible, resulting in social isolation. The journey living with dementia means a different life, being cared for the family, to tell or not to tell, for the carer, loss of previous way of being. We need a friendly, enabling society where people are assured they would be listened to, above all valued, given time and opportunities to be involved and not defined by their diagnosis. The carer with experience knows the reality of what it is to care on a day-to-day basis and the unique impact it has on their loved one. They know the complexities of dealing with health and social care services, which is why they should be central to the management of care of their loved one and their role recognised and respected by all healthcare professionals and community workers. Meeting care needs and finding services and information are what is important. Being subjected to attitudes and experiences such as social distance from others in society, difficulties in accessing services, does not necessarily mean direct association with the word stigma. For dementia to be destigmatised and social inclusion increased, society in general must become active agents for change. Overcoming stigma will help tremendously with achieving the vision of an improved quality of life for people with dementia and their carers. See the person, not the illness. A top priority of Alzheimer's Society Ireland is advocating for implementation of the National Dementia Strategy and the human rights of the person with dementia under the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability, which was ratified last March by the government, and shame to us as a society in Ireland for being the last of the 27 EU countries to do so. Respite in the home is paramount for both the person with dementia, their carer and family, and this is constantly being lobbied for by the ASI in their yearly budget submissions to the government. From personal experience and from the model developed by the Take-Out project, which I was involved in Kinsale, I know that dementia care at home is the most beneficial respite for the carer and for the person with dementia. The Take-Out model has been adopted by the HSE and has been rolled out in the Kinsale-Bandon area. Both Cathy Ryan, who spoke about her journey with dementia at last year's conference, as representative of the Irish Working Group of People with Dementia, and I, as a representative of the Dementia Carers Campaign Network, are working with the HSE National Dementia Office on the steering group for the Post-Diagnostic Supports and Pathways programme. This programme is being developed for a fluid pathway following receipt of a diagnosis of dementia and the appointment of a key worker who could be described as the first port of call following receipt of the diagnosis. Ultimately, it will be incorporated in the home care services being developed by the 9 CHOs for intensive home care packages. The packages already in place are being evaluated by UCC as to their effectiveness and future learning. Education programmes are currently being undertaken, such as the HSE Understand Together and the Alzheimer's Society's joint campaign by people with dementia and carers, which focuses on educating healthcare professionals about supports people need and want on receipt of a diagnosis. Education will destigmatise dementia, will challenge stereotypes, and will address prejudices and discrimination. We are privileged to have with us today speakers who are living with the diagnosis, relating their personal experiences, who are showing that they are more than the diagnosed condition. They are challenging the stigma, are still visible, and are remaining connected. The use of appropriate language plays a very important role in eliminating stigma. Describing a person as gaga is a cruel and hurtful expression to be attributed to a loved one. Over the years, I've heard it used so thoughtlessly. The fact that the part of their brain is not working does not mean that you do not comprehend. It's just that in their muddled thoughts, they're trying to make sense of everything. Your loved one may not remember you or your name, but in their heart and soul, they truly know what you mean to them. People with a dementia diagnosis are not happy being described as sufferers. We are not suffering. While we are initially in shock, following receipt of the diagnosis, we are living with dementia by learning to do so. I say we, as the condition not only affects the person with the diagnosis, but also the whole family. My voice is going. Using demystified as an acronym, this slide shows just some of the symptoms caused by dementia. Most could be symptoms of other conditions, so why the stigma? Am I being naive? I don't think so. This is 2018. Asylums in Ireland, after a horrific history over 200 years, which created the stigma, were gradually closed down, with the last remaining asylum closing in 2014. It is time to move on from the dark history of our past to the enlightenment of the modern era and let stigma be no more. Everyone agrees a vision for change. The policy launched in 2006 is a more enlightened and progressive approach. Chapter 13 reads, as far as the stroke, related organic conditions of vascular origin and Alzheimer's dementia are concerned, the health promotion message is the same as that for preventing cardiovascular disease generally. Early diagnosis and intervention have legitimate track record for improving outcome by at least prolonging quality of life and delaying rates of decline and admission to continuing care. So what is good for your heart is good for your brain. I mentioned earlier about the training. There is a course with the HSE online, and you can, sorry, it's the next one. Okay. If you have reason to be worried about yourself, a family member, oh yes, this is it here, sorry. If you have reason to be worried about yourself, a family member or friend, guidance and information is available by logging on to these two websites. also the National Helpline. And I have a very special message in relation to that, because people think that that's for emergency only. But it doesn't have to be an emergency to ring the National Helpline. Very kind and capable staff are happy to give advice and information at any stage of the journey, as well as assistance when needed. Finally, carers are the champions of dementia care, maintaining the connection, respect and dignity for the person with dementia. Caregiving is a physically, emotionally, financially demanding role that changes throughout the course of the condition. Much support is needed to help the carer during this time. Carers need care too. Thank you.